The new year and rollout of vaccines gave hope that the pandemic was under control in Asia. But a few months on, the region faced new infection waves.
No business was prepared for it. And even if we do know that this would happen, it's very hard to sort of prepare for such a large encompassing shock. The second thing is, geographically, it pretty much, was surrounded the whole world. So there is no way of saying that I can pick this particular location or another location to deal with the shock.
The issue, of course, is that the unpredictability of what is happening. So at different points in time, certain countries or certain regions or certain companies may be affected. And that is actually hard to plan for. So it takes time for certain part of supply chain to turn on and off. It's not just for a certain part of that lockdown period.
The fact that this wave is hitting Asia harder is also of concern.
Asia as a region definitely accounts for a large share of global production. So obviously, if different parts of Asia are affected, then that would have an impact on the supply chain, on the supply to the other parts of the world. So if you look at some examples, earlier this year when South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, were affected because of the resurgence of the second wave, then some of the electronics production was affected, or automotive production. And then, of course, more recently, what we see with Southeast Asia now, there's also disruptions in the textile supply chain.
For now, the manufacturing industry in the region is remaining resilient.
When we look at how global demand patterns have come out, one of the interesting things is that in some economies, the spending on goods actually increased last year, whereas that on services fell because it was not possible at all to spend on services.
Even in Taiwan, which is battling its first major COVID-19 outbreak, the economic numbers have held up so far.
Until now, none of the economic indicators, whether it's export orders, exports themselves, or production, are showing any signs of strain. And that presumably reflects the fact that, at least at this point in time, there are no mobility restrictions or no severe mobility restrictions in factory spaces.
There are headwinds, though. As supply chains go offline and back online, observers worry that prices will go up because of disruption to the supplies of components and their final products.
Definitely, the talk out there is about inflation. I think it's probably unavoidable. I think the question is to what extent the cost gets pushed to the consumer, because there are sometimes the companies themselves may absorb some of the cost increase and pass on some parts to the consumer.
In the longer run, some think that the pandemic may prompt a redesign of supply chain models and push up prices further.
The supply disruptions will work out over time. Again, the supplier disruptions are transient, but in the bigger picture, will this lead to the redesign of supply chains to have a higher pricing by design with a higher reliability, to have localized supply chains? One of the biggest advantages of globalized supply chains was the constant reduction of pricing. But with supply chains spread out globally, I think we will tolerate a higher degree of inflation in the near future, simply because we want a higher degree of reliability.
In the post-pandemic new normal, Asia as a region will continue to be an important hub for manufacturing and global supply chains.
One is that the assumption around this is that supply chains are really all about China. And China is the nerve center of this. But that does not mean that other economies are not important. South Korea is very important. Taiwan is naturally critical in the semiconductor industry. And more recently, ASEAN, whether it's Vietnam or Malaysia, they've all been gaining importance. So this is a very important trend. It's a secular trend that, at least over the next 2 decades, is not going to change, in my view.
And for businesses facing supply chain disruptions, resilience and agility will be key.
So COVID is a somewhat unique situation in the sense that many production sites, many parts of the world are affected at the same time. So it's actually hard to have a foolproof contingency plan. So yes, we should have the contingency plans and all the resilience in place, diversified sourcing and stuff like that. At the same time, we'll probably need to react very quickly.
Beyond COVID-19, analysts say bigger forces will shape companies' decisions to restructure and rebuild their supply chains.
There will be some level of diversification as well, which means that there may be a duplication of facilities. That's also partly a reflection of other broader trends we are seeing, for example, US-China trade frictions, etc. I think a very important change we need to also understand is how is demand going to change over the next few years? ASEAN seems to be maturing at this point in time in terms of growth, in terms of demand, in terms of sophistication. So do we need to really sort of shift our factories closer to Asia for Asian demand? And that by itself requires a big change.